G'day, I'm Ash, welcome back to Tank Mechanic Simulator. It's been a little while since we've checked out this game, mainly because there hasn't been any useful content. And in today's video, we're taking a look at the very first Sherman. Right here we've got a Calliope, or Calliope as people like to call it, and there is a Jumbo Sherman as well. And there are 3 production variants of the early versions of the Shermans. There's the Jumbo, and we'll be restoring the very first one. Here is the D-Day Sherman. Which was in mid-production. It'll have the massive scoops, and it doesn't have that at the current time. And then we also have the late production Sherman as well. There's also the Easy 8 that's already in the game, although we've done a video on that one already. But today is more a bit of a fuck you War Thunder sort of video. So if you like this kind of thing, then by all means let me know in the comments down below. I've got a full series on this kind of thing, and it's been a while since I played this game, so let's get stuck straight into it. First thing, I don't really see any welding ports or any holes in the actual welded hull. I don't know if they've missed this or something like that, but, you know, it's always good to double check. And if you're wondering how long this actually took me to restore this vehicle, it's like an hour and 20 minutes in total, and we're not going to spare you from some of the details. I have edited it down a bit here, just under 40 minutes. Whew, it's going to be a long episode. So, again, strap in. If you like this kind of thing, then go for it. But otherwise, I think what we need to do is we need to go ahead and just remove all the rust from the vehicle and then see what parts need removing from there, restore the rest of them, and then we'll go on from here. Interesting part about the Sherman is I don't really know much about this tank. It's called the M4 Sherman, isn't it? After the Civil War General T. William Sherman. And for me, Australia at least didn't really test the Sherman out that extensively. We did put it up against a Churchill at one point in time. But for me, the Sherman is very much a fascinating vehicle because it was designed around the premise of mass export and shipping a tank around the world. That's why it's got those massive hooks on the front so it can be lifted by crane. The spring hatches on the crew entry points are all spring loaded, so in the event of emergency they can get out easily without having to, die. And that's what makes this vehicle one of the most survivable vehicles, because it was a decently all-round, simple to build and easy to maintain vehicle. And it's got an aviation engine, fun fact, which is a fascinating thing. Now, this vehicle also sold in nearly every corner of the globe, many colours from 1942 to the end of the war. And what you get is, just like a M3 Lee, Sherman suspension was a VSS, vertical volute spring suspension. And the running gear comprised of 3 sets of bogies, 2 each paired with rubber road wheels. What you have, this engine here, the Continental R975, was an air-cooled radial engine. And it was basically fed by 2 tanks of gasoline, which gave around 195 kilometres, about 120 miles of practical range. But it is an aircraft engine, and it has a really complex gear system in order to control it. But here are the intake pipes at the back here. We've got a couple other things to just make sure we have a bit of a fiddle around with. Oh, there's an escape hatch at the very bottom. One of the very few escape hatches to be featured in a vehicle. I know the T-34 had one. I know the Panzer IV also had one, but whether or not it was useful is another story altogether. I kind of really like the production of the M4, right? It was the first factory which delivered the first M4 was the Lima Locomotive Works, and these were sent to the British Army through a Lend-Lease and fought in Africa. That's where the Germans got their hands on Sherman models, which they tested at their testing range where the mouse was. Anyhow, we have a lot of suspension work to do here. And a total of 6,748 M4s were produced, and that's the early variation, as well as 1,600 of the late variation equipped with the 105. Ah, man, there are so many different variants, and this variant that we have in game right now is the M4A1, which is a first major version which was introduced in February 1942. Fully cast rounded upper hull. Production of regular M4A1 totaled 6,000 machines. And it wasn't until 1943 when it was replaced by the M4A176W, which, had a better or longer gun, all sorts of other upgrades as well. I'm not too proficient with the M4 Sherman. But it's interesting that they've detailed all of these interesting sort of pieces in the interior. It's unfortunate because the game really doesn't give you a sort of sense of a scale. It does give you an idea of what the vehicle was like, But if I was to do things differently, it'd be more in a traditional way rather than a restoring the vehicle in the way that the game wants you to restore the vehicle. Because at the moment, if you try and click on something, the interior and the exterior kind of blend into two things once you start taking apart the transmission or sometimes the periscopes, sometimes the other bits and pieces. So it switches between the internal view and the external view quite a lot. Usually you strip down a vehicle to its bare bone capacity, you then document everything you had, and then you basically go through and restore it that way. But look, I've talked about the restoration process on how you should restore a vehicle multiple times. I don't expect anyone else to follow that, but normally, you get an item in, you research living daylights out of an item, you're then presented with what you have, what do you have, what have you purchased, why are you restoring it, how are you restoring it, how are you preserving it, and there are multiple different ways of conservation, and it is a bit of a tricky thing to really understand. So on one hand, you want to do a really good restoration, and there might not be some original parts, or you might break some stuff in the process of actually disassembling some of the vehicle's components, which can happen at periods of time. In this game, there is no real consequence to you breaking something, or you just have to purchase another item. There is no consequence to you having a one-off kind of vehicle, because the whole entire game is based around you just taking out components, then outsourcing them or restoring them yourselves, and then basically assembling the vehicle and then selling it. For me, though, this game does represent an interesting sort of opportunity to look at the internals of a vehicle. And while we're unassembling the turret here, there is so much in components comparatively to any other vehicle. It feels like they've really done a good job with the Shermans. At least this is the very first one, and I hope that in the next three that we're going to do in sequential order until we get to the Jumbo and the Calliope, hopefully they aren't really the same. Because at the moment, it does feel like they'll all be the same. Now, the engine. They've actually put a little bit of thought into this engine. When I go to restore it later, you will see that there is a heap of things that I have to go and do. For some reason, I'm now stuck in the garage door. Back. Get all the push rods out. So I have to take all the pistons, all the piston rods out, all of the other bits and pieces. It wants me to take all the push rods out. Okay. I will do that before I take out anything else. Alright. Should be like one more. Okay, there we are. Take the piston crank, and then we can take the piston rod B out, and then the crankshaft. Because this is an aviation engine, it's meant for 1930s stuff, and they produce so many of these engines. Really quite fascinating seeing it in that bare bones skeleton format. Anyhow, this game kind of gives you a unique perspective on some of the shapes of the vehicles, I guess. They've done an okay job with the modelling. Alright, we've painted both the turret and the internals. It's now time to go to assembly mode and basically put everything that we've restored in. Yeah, I do like outsourcing. It saves me a bunch of time than having to restore each individual part. So what you do is you strip the vehicle completely back, you go through the list and go, okay, well I've got a list of these parts that I have somewhat restored. Let me just go and outsource all the repairs, and then basically all I have to do is install them. Makes life much easier. But I sat down, and for the sake of time for this video, I sat down and I basically restored every part manually. And it took me too long. I'll never do that again for the sake of video timing, which is why I always do things in a more strict traditional way, which is why you never see me digging up tanks, which is why you never see me doing any of the other parts of this sort of game, because it is a time why it's not time efficient, really. Essentially, as they say, time is money. But for me, the satisfaction comes out of just restoring the vehicle and getting it done, because there are so many just complex parts and different things inside vehicles that we don't really notice. And here I am just assembling bits and pieces. You just see the white outlines, you're just basically installing whatever you can, wherever you can. It's not like Car Mechanic Simulator where there is you have to do things in a specific order or else. It's not like Aircraft Mechanic Simulator either, where that is also a crucial element to that kind of thing. Because the game doesn't really give you missions to really restore a vehicle in a specific way. They do have like missions where you have to restore certain parts of vehicles, but they don't give you, this is how you have to do it before you progress to the next vehicle, or this is basically like, oh, I don't know, teaching you how to maintain a vehicle properly. It just feels a little bit out of place. That's not a criticism of the game though, because they generally have improved with their latest editions of vehicles, and I'm glad that they have. But in the past it was, well, it's a bit rotund, a bit square, a bit sort of boring, and a bit bland. And I'm glad that, like, for example, with the mouse, The Mouse's edition, they really stepped up their quality in terms of internal componentry. The first bit we actually have to screw in. It feels like the rest of the components we would have had to screw in anyway, but we'll go round and round and round and round as we use the impact driver and basically screw in every single screw. Oh, missed one. Easy peasy. Alright, put the cannon cradle in. Let's put all the... everything just pops up at once. And if you're trying to put in a specific element before you pop up or put in another new element, oftentimes the outline of one of those other parts which you're trying to install will actually outweigh and get you to a bit in trouble. So be careful when you're putting in little parts, because sometimes you can't see the tiniest little things. But I will admit, there is a lot of hydraulics here. For something that you think wasn't hydraulically stabilized, maybe this version is, I'm not entirely sure. I remember that some of the Shermans were stabilized. I'm not sure if the early ones were. This almost looks complete. Mind you, we do have a couple of interior pieces that we have to have a look at. Which one is that? Turret interior. We've got the elevation locks. Okay, forgive me. So we're just going to install the loader seat, and then the turret is basically complete. So many companies and so many people used these Shermans. It was just fascinating. What you have is a radial engine, which was built by the Wright Aeronautical Division of the Curtiss-Wright. The engines had about 15.98 litre displacement, ratings about 300 to 450 horsepower, about 220 to 340 kilowatts. And they made so many of them, 7,000 by Wright and over 53,000 by Continental. Essentially, it's a 9-cylinder radial piston engine, and it's really, really fascinating. From what it looks like, and this is what we learned in aviation school, because they used them in a whole heap of different things. The applications were for the Aviranson, Curtiss Kingbird, the Duotone D31, the Fokker C5, the Ford Trimotor, just various different applications depending on which version you wanted. But they developed the R975 as a bit of a ground-based vehicle. The Skiorski even used one as a prototype helicopter sort of a vehicle. The Sexton, the Ram tank, the McDonnell XV-1, which was an experimental helicopter. Got the M40 gun carriage, the M12 motor gun carriage, the M7 Priest, the M3 Lee, the Kellett XR-10. It's a helicopter that was really quite sort of crazy. The Kangaroo armoured personnel carrier and the Grizzly, as well as the Beechcraft Model 18, which is a 6 to 11 seat twin-engine low-wing, tail-wing aircraft, which was produced by the Beech, which is really, really fascinating at the same time. But yeah, seems like all the push rods and everything are definitely in the right sort of category. This is a tedious sort of thing doing this. One of these refurbished engines from this time period would cost you at least $40,000 just to renovate. If you had one in a decent condition. You know, other Rolls-Royce aircraft tend to go for, you know, hundreds of thousands, and yeah, well, it's looking a little bit like this. Very specialty kind of stuff, because the thing is, we don't really use radials much anymore. We've sort of gone with inline boxer engines and V6s and the inline Vs, whereas horizontally opposed sort of engines tend to be more of an aircraft thing in civilian aviation. When you do encounter one of these machines, you will distinctly know it, because it smells and looks and sounds so distinct comparatively to some of the other smaller aviation aircraft that you see these days. And one of my fondest early memories was actually of seeing a radial aircraft just fly by. I believe it was the Catalina at Haas in New South Wales, down here in Australia. When I saw that thing fly for the first time and hear it fly over, it was very fantastic. I don't remember my first time seeing a radial engine, but I do remember that there are quite a few aircraft that have radial engines. For example, the Boomerang is one of those aircraft that has a radial engine. It sounds fantastic as well. Going back to my time working a little bit in aviation. Otherwise, what you have is a very, very interesting sort of componentry. 2 valves per cylinder with a push rod, that massive thing we installed earlier. Supercharger with a implemented gear ratio, 80 octane, and a reduction gear is basically direct drive. it is quite fascinating what you can get out of this componentry, considering, you know, it has a weight of 306 kilos, or about 675 pounds. And that's quite a lot, considering, you know, it's just an engine which is just a radial. It's just mass, just utter mass. So while we're installing the valves and the other bits and pieces with the valve arms and the valve covers, or should I say the timing covers, then we'll go through and just double check if we've actually completed everything on this engine, which I don't think we have. It is quite annoying because there is 2 timing covers for each individual piston, and that produces 18 different sort of elements here which I have to make sure that I've actually done. And there is a lot more to these engines than what this game showcases, but for the most part I think this is actually quite alright. Alright, ignition wise, I was just going to be one massive blob like that. That's done. You don't have to connect them individually or do anything like that. Oh, damn, that is a shame. Anyway, I'm going to put it on the carburetor cover, and then we're going to put the carburetor on. Interesting, because the design differed from the aviation. That bracket that the aviation sort of aircraft would have had wouldn't have existed. So for the tank model, they just shoved this massive rectangle sort of thing. I don't know, it's sort of futuristic looking, UFO looking engine when you put the shroud on and the cover. Because aviation, we didn't really have those. We had the cowlings and the outer engines and stuff like that. Let's have a look. The engine is 100% there. We're done with the engine. Fantastic. Right, moving on, we've got the other engine panels and the other componentry, and this is going to take a long time, so I might have to sort of time, or what's the word, speed up the footage here. Come on. Come in. Right, sometimes the impact driver doesn't go all the way down, so you end up having to just sort of spam click until it does. Come on, go in. Come on. And sometimes it can be a bit of a pain, but I don't know if that's game design, but it is utterly infuriating when you have to install 1,000 odd parts and you need to get this whole entire componentry done because you can't do anything else. Come on, in. I can't click there. See what I mean? Can be a bit of a pain. I'm trying to... Clicking. Come on. There we are. We're done now, finally. Alright. So, we have the running gear. And we've still got that special issue with the impact driver. Come on. I'll just install the bogie frames instead. Alright, we've finally done most of this side with all the bogies and everything. Hopefully you got a representation of what that looked like. The HVSS system here is really interesting because it uses a cantilever bogie system in order to really sort of adjust the suspension. You can adjust the suspension arms, you can then basically have them on independent springs. And so what that allows it to do is have a much safer, sort of a smoother ride. It's a very fascinating system that you should definitely ask an expert about, because I'm no longer an expert on tanks, more of an aircraft guy. Anyhow, we've gone and done that. Let's go install all the peripherals on the outside of the vehicle. We've also got to go and install all the different parts and bits and pieces. So we're going to do that on the outside first, then we're going to go do the interior. Again, I don't know whether I'll cut up the footage even further. It's nice to have a long video, but I don't want it to be an hour and 20 minutes long, and that's kind of the length of the footage at the moment. So let me know in the comments down below. Would you rather see me install every single individual part, or do you like this sort of slightly cut down version? Anyhow, we've put all the fans in, and I have to restore that fan thing. We'll do that later. I'm going to go install all the hatches, all the various bits and pieces around it, as well as all the other covers and the headlights and the front machine gun housing there, which we don't actually have a machine gun for. There is a direct vision cover as well. Driver's hatch. Put in all the periscopes and the front headlight. We've got this massive sort of flat gap here, which I believe is for the transmission housing itself. That is something I don't really want to touch just yet, because that'll be an effort on its own. But we'll go through and have a look at some of the other parts first. I think the turret's done. Yeah, it is done. And we'll put on all the engine covers and everything else, and then we'll go through and we'll probably do the transmission. So, I'll get back to you, because the transmission is probably going to be the longest part of this whole entire video. Alrighty, so we've installed some of the boxes and some of the other ammunition components on the inside of this vehicle. I've got a periscope. What is it? It's coming up with something random. And here is the differential shaft with the different gears. For some reason, the game has it floating. To be its own independent unit. I'm a little bit confused and perplexed by this, but I wasn't aware of how complex the differential was, because getting an aircraft engine to really work in a way that you would really determine to be useful means that they had to put this massive drive gear system in order to make the aircraft engine work correctly, because an aircraft engine works at a higher RPM than a regular engine. They're definitely higher torque, definitely higher power, and that is probably the reason why they chose them. They're producing them en masse anyway. Why not convert them into a useful sort of thing? Differential plate, differential bolts that then slot through and then obviously combine everything together. We haven't even touched the gearbox or any of the other bits and pieces yet. We're just touching some of the bearings and some of those parts here. It's a bit awkward to work on this because I don't really want to go into the internal camera mode because it just sort of plays up with things. And already, as you can see, if you don't miss those crucial steps, sometimes you can miss the timing covers and some of the other gears. So it is important that you make sure and go through and do all that, because, yeah, I frustratingly forgot to put a gear lever in and subsequently had to tear down the whole entire gearbox again. So I've done this twice now, and it's just quite annoying. All the different gearboxes, the gearbox shafts, the bearings that you would have already put on. As you can see, I'm trying to put on the bearings underneath, but it's putting all the collars and everything else on the top of the gearbox itself. And this just keeps going, this whole entire assembly. Synchronization gears, the different gears. I wonder how many gears a Sherman would have. In fact, I don't even know. Let's have a look. Because it should. Operational range was about 175 US gallons, 146 imperial, so it's about 520 litres. Maximum speed is about 30 kilometers an hour. What we have here is an engine, which doesn't say what particular power weight ratio. Okay, so it's 5 forward and 1 reverse gears. It's a Spicer manual synchromesh transmission, at least according to Tank Encyclopedia. But yeah, a huge amount of stuff to bolt together. There's the housing. We've got other parts and things to install yet. We've got the rest of the other housings, and it just keeps going and keeps going. I'm amazed. In fact, I was blown away at the amount of parts there was. Oil cap, because of course everything has to be oiled. Gear levers and gear shafts and collars for everything, and just what on earth is going on here? And then finally a gearbox lever. The driver really had to do a lot. You know, you've got your forward, right, left pedals. Then you've got your gear levers. Then you've got your gear selectors. And then you've also obviously got like a gearbox here on the back of the engine. I mean, it's all in there. That's a lot of stuff to be looking at. Let's install the fan. I think for the most part, we're almost done here. We've got a couple more ball bearings to go. And then it's asking me to put in the housing, differential housing. Again, so easy just to slip the whole entire differential out in one unit and then repair it that way. But final drive cover. Okay, we're getting close enough to also being put on the spacers, and then obviously putting on the actual sprocket wheel itself. We've actually got to put in the housing. See, it just sort of like flows like this. Stored on the front by those massive screws at all time. Sherman's not a small vehicle by any part of the means, so this is kind of fascinating to me. The fact that just this housing is basically the whole entire transmission on the front. I know this from playing War Thunder when you shoot a Sherman in the transmission with another tank, but I always thought it particularly funny. No other tank had such a big, bulgy sort of front like that. I mean, yeah, sure, the German tanks did, but I don't know, I'm just kind of fascinated by the whole entire front end of this thing, because considering the way the game's designed it in this particular concept. Alright, put the trunnion on, and then basically the sprocket then gets attached to that, and that allows it to freely move with the ball bearings, and then we can install the tracks. Wow. Okay, we've installed the other side, there we are. Now we're going to put the trunnion on and then the sprocket wheel. I think we're done for the tracks. I have spared you some of the other footage of just watching me do this mindlessly. It is a very fun game, but it does tend to be a bit repetitive. And there we go. We've got some of the extra parts to install on the vehicle. I think we're almost there, about 91% done. So I'll get back to you once we actually go fully install everything from that's remaining in the interior. So let's go into a time-lapse sort of mode again. But yeah, anyway, we've got a couple of pipes to install, we've got a fuel line, so we've got a couple of other bits and pieces, we've got some of the drive line as well to also install, the drive shaft itself, a couple of odd ends and a couple of fuel ignition and drain covers to put installed. But once we've done that, we're now going to come back to the painting room. We're going to make an Australian looking Sherman tank with an Australian-esque looking camouflage. I think that looks pretty alright. Hit the apply button. We're now done from the paint room, and I think that looks like an Australian Sherman. And we've 100% completed the vehicle. We've moved it to this warehouse. Well, eventually we'll see all 5 other vehicles, and maybe even the original Sherman filling out this warehouse as well. So, again, stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed at least some of it. I look forward to producing the next couple of episodes. My name is Ash. Catch you in the next one. And fuck War Thunder.